You can never truly understand what it's like to make a video game until you've made one yourself. That's why I can only offer so much insight as someone who's never put a line of code together in an attempt to make the next great innovative gaming experience. You know, I sling mud at everything that moves. But honestly, I don't know a damn thing. Or rather, I get the why, but the how is a lot more complicated. The finer mechanics of game development aren't really anything that I can do justice to in a video like this, but I can perhaps shed some light on how horrendously complicated things can get when a game's gestation period doesn't go smoothly. Development hell is a term used to describe the lengthy period of time in which a game, or whatever, spends in production with very little or inconsistent progress being made towards completion. Basically, the average game should only take so long to make, but some take way longer because of issues behind the scenes. And that's all fine and terrible, but what I find intriguing about development hell is that no two afflicted games suffer from the same setbacks. There also isn't an industry standard of quality to expect from a game that spent so long in development, since while you might think that constantly reworking features or starting from scratch would lead to an awful mess of a game, that hasn't always been the case. So I guess if anything, I'm more interested in the story behind a game that made it all the way through to the other side. Some are great, some are terrible, and yet all are very interesting. Hey, this is the internet. If you're not fascinated by turmoil and disruption, you're just not doing it right. With developers getting exponentially more ambitious, game development has only gotten bigger and more complicated over the years. The small groups of no more than half a dozen core members that got to work on games like Ocarina of Time have been dwarfed by entire armies of programmers and graphic designers that put their efforts towards the AAA game of your choosing. You'd have to imagine that there's at least a small element of too many cooks spoiling the broth, and having to manage that many moving parts both in the game itself and its development is an undertaking that I'd never want to do. Then again, that would imply that indie games are completely immune from development hell. And who in their right mind would believe that? Having a smaller dev team of just a couple of people is no guarantee that those people are gonna get along with each other, and that key members of that team are gonna maintain high levels of enthusiasm throughout the project. You know, I've made videos that have taken longer than expected and eventually get to the point where just someone make it stop. I hadn't even heard of Owlboy until last year after hearing that the developers of Cuphead had bent over backwards and then some to get their game out into the world, in what I thought was the most tumultuous development of an indie game around, but not even close. Owlboy started its long road to freedom in 2007 when this type of retro Metroid-inspired indie game wasn't as prevalent as they are a decade later. And the original plan, having shown the game off in 2010 to a lot of acclaim, was to capitalize on this wave of excitement by releasing Owlboy in 2011. Unfortunately, life is never simple, as creator Simon Anderson found out through a further 6 years of torment, ranging from relatively simple problems like the burden of fan expectation resulting in the team starting over multiple times, to more tragic ones like multiple deaths in the family, his house burning down, and a bout of depression. It goes to show that while indie developers aren't shackled by corporate politics, they are of course stricken by personal issues that end up affecting a larger share of a smaller dev team. Considering that Owlboy garnered so much support across its development, it wasn't much surprise when Owlboy proved to be absolutely worth the wait when it came out in late 2016. It's a little strange that it started its development before this golden age of indie Metroidvanias and released after the market was heavily saturated with them, but it looks great, has a lot of unique ideas, and is well worth your time. Simon Anderson was able to make a great game despite enduring a decade of personal hell. What's your excuse? When a game is in development for such a long period of time and being passed around numerous different platforms with their own hardware limitations, the odds are stacked very heavily against the game being any good when it's finally released. It's amazing to think how many games out there started life on one console but had to shift focus to another console with completely different specifications. All of a sudden, when taking this into account, you can forgive games like Sonic Boom Rise of Lyric that had to redesign most of the game on very short notice, since the Wii U is a different animal to anything else from that generation of consoles. Then again, I'm not going to offer Sonic Boom too much pity because A, playing this game is a colossal waste of anyone's time and I hate it with every fibre in my body, and B, Mother 3 managed these problems quite well by comparison. Not well enough to get an official Western release, mind you, but I don't think that was much of a priority when everything was unravelling in the late 90s and early 2000s. Some of you might remember that Earthbound 64 was an idea that Nintendo were playing around with as a method of showing off both the N64 in the best light and this wonderfully original RPG franchise, fresh off the brilliant but commercially unsuccessful in the West Earthbound. But no, it's fine, you got an exciting new 3D console, so you just need to sort out the marketing and maybe throw in RabbidLuigi's special thing about subscribing to his channel for more videos and clicking bells for notifications of new uploads that really annoys people for some reason, and you'll be right as rain. Maybe surprisingly, it was untethered ambition that set Earthbound 64 onto the road to development hell, and Nintendo's decision to incorporate the ultimately terrible 64DD was the main issue here. The game was very demanding on the console, but time was running out for the N64, and what is graphically impressive for the N64 isn't as amazing on the GameCube. Earthbound 64 was eventually cancelled in the year 2000, which should have been the end of it. But some guy called Shigeru Miyamoto wanted the game to come to fruition in some way, and that guy usually gets what he wants. Alongside mainstay Shigesato Itoi, the ambition was toned down and the focus was redirected to what Itoi especially does best: narrative and complex themes. Mother 3 was released in 2006 on the GBA with merely updated graphics instead of a transformed graphical style, and a story that is still one of the most emotionally resonant in all of gaming. We didn't get our 3D Mother game, but we didn't really need one, something that Satoru Iwata admitted after the time in an interview. I wouldn't trade this for a lot of games. Development hell has its upsides. They're not a ton of fun to experience firsthand, but they do provide the world with very useful stories of just how mismanaged games can get and what not to do during development. On a smaller scale, they also help to temper expectations for a game, because if it takes so long to come out, you may have forgotten about it. I want to briefly touch on Vaporware because I feel like it's very important with this subject matter. Vaporware has numerous different applications when it comes to video games, but the easiest definition is something that was advertised but never released, with the product either never making it out of the conceptual stage or being swallowed up by development hell. There are many games out there that have gone the way of Vaporware, some more famous than others, but you can equate them to being the ultimate fate for a development cycle that doesn't end with a game actually being made. Many development hell games may feel like they're approaching Vaporware status without a constant stream of updates, and that brings me very nicely to The Last Guardian, a game that I still can't believe was actually made. Because, without regular check-ins, how can you have any faith that Sony or Team Ico are still interested in making this game after so many setbacks and delays? Team Ico especially, since they focus on this artsy trilogy of games that include Shadow of the Colossus and Ico of course, and are a studio that closed down in 2011 following the departure of director Fumito Ueda. When you lose the driving force for a project this abstract, it's not like you can wheel in any old game dev off the street to help finish such a unique concept for a video game. I'm fairly confident they'd never do it justice. Then there's the self-sustaining issue of the delays gradually making The Last Guardian less relevant as a piece of software, since the gaming climate undergoes significant changes every 5 years or so, and having to develop a game for improved PS4-shaped hardware presents even more challenges. Losing key members of Team Ico didn't help, but the cobbled-together crew kept their head down and made something that, while not without its faults, is significantly better than we could have ever hoped for. Trico is a bit of a dick, but there is so much to The Last Guardian that could have easily been thrown together in a mad rush to avoid yet another delay, but Sony's Japan studio and Gen Design kinda pulled it off. Can't see them making another one in a hurry though. I wouldn't want to. Development hell comes with an interesting and hard to define grey area. With large franchises that have been making games since seemingly the dawn of civilized society, many ideas and concepts that were cut from previous games remain floating around in the minds of creatives working on future games that may eventually see the light of day many years later. This technically doesn't count as development hell, and neither does a game that is slowly morphed into something a little different to accommodate new demands within the industry. Since the turn of the century, Final Fantasy has had an eventful time working out exactly what kind of games to make, and also what kind of games its player base will buy. They had the online games, the many variants of Final Fantasy XIII that definitely didn't outstay their welcome or anything, and also the one that came out on the wrong console. Maybe you could say that there was a lack of concentrated focus on Square Enix's behalf, but every game released in that period of time is at least passably good. Were they working on something in the background that took staff and resources away from where it was needed? You could say that. The story behind Final Fantasy XV is one of an arduous journey to constantly reinvent and readjust this brand new vision for a Final Fantasy game with darker themes and a completely different kind of name. We got a trailer for Versus 13 back in the day, and it looks nothing like the game we got in 2016. I suppose in the end they were saving 13 for their special little project that just went on for way too long. I say that Versus 13 looked nothing like 15, but there's cars, so kinda the same, I don't know. The problem is that in an effort to reinvent the franchise via this spin-off game, Final Fantasy XV didn't really know what kind of game it wanted to be for the longest time. It spent 6 years as a spin-off game before becoming the next big game in the franchise in 2012. At which point most of the key members of staff, Final Fantasy, and gaming in general had all moved on to other things. For reference, 6 years is a fairly lengthy period of time for an average AAA game, and this game had more on top of that. It's actually a wonderful place to be creatively, because Square let the team in charge of Versus 13, who also made Kingdom Hearts, go absolutely crazy with new ideas until those concepts start to grow wildly out of control and intervention was required. Not the intervention that nearly saw Final Fantasy XV turn into a musical, but there's always next time. The man in charge, Tetsuya Nomura, was replaced, and Square decided that there was no way that a mostly conceptual game was likely to benefit much from being released on a console on its last legs like the PS3. That's why from 2012 onwards, game engines were rebuilt, target consoles were updated, and the large collection of unrelated ideas that made up Final Fantasy Versus 13 started to take shape as 15. The game that came out 2 years ago is some way off the original version for a radically new Final Fantasy game, but considering how loose and unrefined things were after 6 years of development, maybe it's for the best that we got just a pretty great Final Fantasy game instead. When you consider all this drama, perhaps it's no surprise that we've heard very little about the Final Fantasy VII remake recently. I'm not saying it'll be terrible, but watch this space. Despite the stereotype of any game that goes through development hell being an unfocused, unfinished mess, you may have noticed that everything I've talked about to this point has been fairly competent. Despite numerous delays and technical difficulties behind the scenes, these games have been able to rise above all the drama as something that can be enjoyed on its own merits. It's a goddamn miracle when you think about it, and a glowing endorsement of some of the talent working in the video game industry. It's also a common enough problem that points to a more troubling trend of publishers pushing too much work onto struggling developers and reaping rewards that may perhaps encourage similar behavior. For that reason, I suppose I'm glad that Duke Nukem Forever got made in the end. Because you really do need an extreme example of how ridiculous development hell can get, and also what kind of mangled mess of a video game you end up with at the end. Some of the previous games I mentioned had semi-concrete builds that journalists could play or at least report on, but Duke Nukem Forever spent most of its 15-year development cycle putting out the occasional teaser or promo image as a way of reminding the world that eventually this game is being made. If you think the face of gaming undergoes major developments in 5 years, then you can imagine the countless problems associated with a 15-year development cycle under many different studios and directions. The fact that we got Duke Nukem Forever at all was the surprising part. The quality of said game, a little less so. It's very important to understand that just because this game spent 15 years in limbo, that does not mean that anyone spent that amount of time working on Duke Nukem Forever. The final product that was available for people to spend real money on in 2011 scarcely resembles a functioning first-person shooter, with every other feature coming across as incredibly dated and seemingly frozen in time from a different era entirely. Except it's a really bad example of early 2000s shooters, since Duke Nukem Forever leapt from one game engine to the next, and no time was taken to get the most out of what eventual developers Gearbox settled on. It's the kind of game that is so blissfully unaware of how bad that it almost feels like a parody of a typical Duke Nukem game, which, of course, was already a parody of over-the-top uber-macho protagonists. The distinction is that Duke Nukem 3D, the game that preceded Forever, was also an important pioneer for the FPS genre. You could say that Duke Nukem Forever is also a pioneer, but not for anything to be proud of. If we're lucky, we'll never see a game like this again. This was RabbidLuigi, and when you think about it way too hard, Duke Nukem Forever almost feels like the culmination of a joke that lasted more than a decade. It's almost like Gearbox were in on the act and decided to release the game even though they knew no good can come from it. And it's odd, because when a game is delayed for that long, you'd think there would be people who were excited for it. But when we got a release date, I don't remember anybody being all that thrilled. And yet we still needed this game, because we needed to see the saga end. Closure is so goddamn important. Have you got a topic that you'd like me to talk about next week? Make sure you leave a comment about that down below, because I'll be taking the most interesting suggestions and making a poll on the next video. In fact, here's one right now that I prepared from last week. I'll be revealing the winner of the poll on Twitter and taking suggestions for games to talk about that are related to that topic. So feel free to follow me over there so we can keep in touch. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.